There is a voice inside every human mind that few dare to confront, yet all are influenced by. The inner critic. It is relentless, subtle, and often convincing, whispering doubt, highlighting flaws, and magnifying failure long after the world has moved on. This voice is not a simple nuisance. It is a powerful psychological force capable of shaping your decisions, undermining ambition, and distorting your perception of self. Left unchecked, it will master you, quietly dictating your behavior and sapping your confidence. Yet when understood and engaged with deliberately, this inner critic can be transformed from tyrant to teacher, guiding growth rather than sabotaging it. Why does the inner critic exist in the first place? Why does it often speak with a louder, more persuasive voice than encouragement or reason? And most importantly, what is the cost of ignoring it, of letting this silent saboteur shape the trajectory of your life? By the end of this video, you will understand the psychological roots of the inner critic, why it gains power, and the strategies through which it can be confronted, understood, and ultimately mastered. You will discover that the battle is not about silencing the critic entirely, but about transforming its energy into insight, resilience, and disciplined action. Philosophically, the inner critic is nothing new. Nietzsche spoke of self-overcoming, the idea that the most profound challenge is mastering oneself, including the internalized standards and judgments we carry. Socrates emphasized the importance of self-knowledge, understanding the hidden forces that guide our behavior. Jung described the shadow, the unacknowledged aspects of our psyche, parts that, when ignored, can sabotage our potential. The inner critic is, in many ways, the shadow externalized, a voice shaped by past experiences, societal expectations, and internalized fears that demands confrontation. Psychologically, the critic is deeply embedded in human cognition. It is reinforced through negative self-talk, cognitive distortions, and early conditioning. Habits of thought such as catastrophizing, overgeneralization, and selective attention amplify perceived failures and diminish achievements. Evolutionarily, this critical voice may have once served adaptive purposes, a way to anticipate danger or avoid social disapproval. But in the modern world, it often becomes maladaptive, undermining performance, creativity, and emotional well-being. Understanding the mechanisms by which the inner critic operates is the first step toward reclaiming control. Emotionally, this inner voice carries weight far beyond the facts. A single internalized critique can overshadow accomplishments, erode confidence, and generate chronic stress. Anxiety, shame, and self-doubt are its tools, convincing you that you are inadequate, unworthy, or incapable. Yet paradoxically, the inner critic often signals areas where attention is needed, not to punish, but to illuminate unresolved fears, unexamined beliefs, and opportunities for growth. Awareness transforms the critic from a tyrant into a guide, capable of revealing the hidden dynamics of your psyche. Socially, the inner critic is reinforced by external pressures. Societal expectations, cultural norms, and social comparison all feed the voice within, providing evidence that supports its judgments. Social media, performance metrics, and competitive environments amplify the internalized standards that the critic uses to manipulate thought and behavior. Recognizing the external sources that fuel internal criticism allows for strategic distancing and reframing, weakening the critic's automatic authority over your mind. Narratively, this dynamic is evident in countless human endeavors. The musician who hesitates to perform, the writer who delays publishing, the entrepreneur who doubts every decision, each is contending with the same invisible adversary. Psychology and philosophy provide insight into the mechanisms and stakes, but lived experience confirms a universal truth. Mastery over the inner critic determines the capacity to act, create, and flourish. By confronting this voice, we reclaim agency, turning what was once a source of self-doubt into a catalyst for disciplined growth. Cognitively, strategies for engagement begin with awareness. Observing the inner critic without judgment allows for the recognition of patterns, triggers, recurring narratives, and the emotional charge it carries. Mindfulness and reflective practices create space between stimulus and response, enabling deliberate choice rather than reactive submission. Journaling, cognitive restructuring, and self-inquiry illuminate distortions, replacing unconscious submission with conscious negotiation. Knowledge without action is insufficient, but awareness opens the door to transformation. Ultimately, the inner critic is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a force to be mastered. By understanding its origins, recognizing its influence, and strategically engaging with its energy, You can transform self-doubt into insight, paralysis into action, and fear into growth. Subscribing allows you to continue exploring the tools, philosophical frameworks, and psychological strategies necessary to master this silent saboteur. The question that remains is essential. Will you let the inner critic define your life, or will you confront it, understand it, and convert its power into a catalyst for mastery? The inner critic exerts its influence in subtle, persistent ways. It thrives in the spaces between thought and action, quietly shaping perception, interpretation, and behavior without requiring conscious consent. Often, we are unaware of its control until we notice patterns of hesitation, self-doubt, or avoidance. What feels like free decision-making is frequently the critic guiding us toward caution, conformity, or inaction. Its power lies not in overt domination, but in its ability to embed itself seamlessly into the narrative of the self, convincing you that its judgments are truth rather than influence. Psychologically, the inner critic is a composite of past experiences, learned judgments, and evolutionary predispositions. Childhood feedback, social conditioning, and cultural expectations coalesce into an internalized voice that measures worth, competence, and morality against an often unattainable standard. Cognitive distortions amplify this effect, magnifying mistakes, minimizing achievements, and interpreting neutral events as evidence of inadequacy. Neuropsychology shows that repeated engagement with this voice strengthens neural pathways associated with negative self-evaluation, making its influence feel automatic and immutable. Awareness of these mechanisms is crucial. Recognizing the architecture of self-criticism illuminates how much of our experience is unconsciously shaped by internalized authority. Emotionally, the inner critic exerts control by manipulating fear, shame, and guilt. Anxiety arises when anticipated failure is magnified internally. Shame undermines confidence. Guilt binds the mind to past actions. The critic leverages these emotions to suppress action, enforce perfectionism, or maintain safety within familiar patterns. Yet, paradoxically, these same emotional signals can be harnessed as guides. Where the critic highlights fear, growth may be possible. Where it magnifies failure, insight and improvement may be gained. The key lies in shifting from reactive acceptance to reflective engagement, using the emotional charge as a compass rather than a cage. Behaviorally, the inner critic manifests in procrastination, avoidance, perfectionism, and excessive self-monitoring. Tasks remain incomplete, creative projects stalled, and opportunities avoided, not due to lack of skill, but due to internalized resistance. Recognizing these behavioral patterns is the first step toward intervention. Cognitive behavioral techniques, mindfulness, and reflective journaling can expose the critic's subtle manipulations, creating the space to act intentionally rather than reactively. By incrementally challenging its assertions, attempting tasks despite fear, accepting imperfection, and reframing perceived failure, the critic's grip weakens and personal agency strengthens. Philosophically, confronting the inner critic aligns with the ancient wisdom of Stoicism and self-overcoming. Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus emphasize the necessity of distinguishing what is within one's control and what is not, while Nietzsche highlighted the transformative potential of internal struggle. The critic, once recognized as an internalized authority rather than an absolute truth, becomes a tool rather than a tyrant. Mastery emerges from conscious engagement, deliberate challenge, and the cultivation of resilience, not from suppression or denial. Socially, awareness of the inner critic fosters empathy and perspective. Understanding that others are similarly influenced by internalized judgments and self-criticism changes how we relate, judge, and collaborate. Recognizing the universality of this phenomenon reduces shame, encourages patience, and allows for constructive dialogue, both with oneself and with others. Subtle awareness of these dynamics can transform not only internal experience but interpersonal relationships, providing clarity and depth in social engagement. Narratively, the process of mastering the inner critic is rarely instantaneous or dramatic. The writer who publishes despite doubt, the entrepreneur who acts despite fear of failure, the student who submits imperfect work, all exemplify the subtle victories that accumulate into profound transformation. Each deliberate confrontation chips away at the critic's authority, replacing automatic self-doubt with conscious action. Psychology explains the mechanisms. Philosophy provides the moral and existential framework. Lived experience confirms that mastery is built through repeated, courageous engagement. Ultimately, Understanding the inner critic's mechanisms reveals both the challenge and the opportunity. The voice within is powerful because it is subtle, pervasive, and deeply internalized, yet it is not invincible. Awareness, reflection, and deliberate practice create the conditions for mastery. Subscribing allows you to continue exploring practical, psychological, and philosophical strategies to recognize, confront, and harness the inner critic, converting it from silent saboteur into a guide for disciplined, intentional growth. The essential question remains: will you allow the inner critic to shape your path unconsciously, or will you take deliberate control and transform its power into your own? Mastery of the inner critic is not about silencing it completely. It is about transforming its energy from an instrument of self-sabotage into a guide for self-awareness, growth, and disciplined action. The critic's voice, though often harsh and relentless, originates from a desire to protect, to prepare, and to warn. Left unchecked, it becomes tyrannical, preventing risk, innovation, and fulfillment. But when approached with understanding, reflection, and strategic engagement, it can illuminate blind spots, highlight areas for improvement, and reinforce the values that matter most. Philosophically, this aligns with the wisdom of Nietzsche, who emphasized the process of self-overcoming. Nietzsche recognized that human beings are perpetually confronted with internal and external obstacles, and that true strength emerges not from avoiding these challenges, but from grappling with them consciously. The inner critic, when harnessed properly, becomes a mirror reflecting the areas of life where courage, discipline, and conscious engagement are required. The voice that once paralyzed can paradoxically propel you toward meaningful achievement, offering insight where complacency would only provide comfort. Psychologically, transforming the critic involves a combination of awareness, reframing, and structured action. Awareness begins with observing the critic without judgment, noting the triggers, patterns, and emotional tone of self-critical thoughts. Reframing redirects the critic's energy, converting statements of limitation into prompts for reflection or improvement. For instance, instead of internalizing, "you're not good enough," one can interpret it as, "this is an area where I can grow." Structured action, deliberate practice, incremental challenges, and habit formation provides tangible evidence that the critic's predictions are not immutable truths but opportunities for deliberate mastery. Emotionally, the process cultivates resilience. Each confrontation with fear, doubt, or internalized judgment strengthens the capacity to act despite discomfort. Over time, the critic's intensity diminishes not because it disappears, but because its authority is contested and balanced by deliberate, empowered action. Emotions that once paralyzed, shame, anxiety, self-doubt, become signals to guide reflection rather than chains to bind behavior. This shift transforms internal experience, fostering confidence, authenticity, and the ability to engage fully with life's challenges. Behaviorally, practical strategies solidify mastery. One effective approach is creating a critique journal, recording the critic's recurring statements, evaluating their validity, and responding with evidence-based counterpoints. Another is the practice of deliberate exposure, taking small, controlled risks in areas where the critic discourages action, gradually weakening its influence through repeated, positive experience. Mindful pauses between impulse and action allow space for reason to intervene, reducing automatic submission to self-criticism. Each incremental step builds the capacity for intentionality, reinforcing the principle that mastery is an ongoing process, not a final destination. Socially, engaging the inner critic consciously enhances interpersonal effectiveness. Individuals who recognize and manage their internal self-judgment communicate more clearly, act with integrity, and approach conflict with calm awareness. They can empathize with others' internal struggles, recognizing that the same patterns of self-criticism and unconscious influence exist in everyone. This understanding fosters patience, collaboration, and the ability to navigate complex social dynamics without unnecessary self-sabotage or projection. Every human being carries within them a silent, relentless war, a power struggle that is invisible yet decisive. It is not fought in boardrooms, streets, or even in relationships with others. It is fought in the mind, in the heart, and across the landscape of desire, fear, and ambition. You are simultaneously your greatest ally and your fiercest adversary. The struggle between who you are and who you want to become, between instinct and reason, impulse and discipline, defines not just your choices but the very trajectory of your life. Why is it that despite knowing what is best for us, whether it is to work toward a goal, maintain health, or cultivate meaningful relationships, we so often sabotage ourselves. Why does the part of us that craves growth clash so violently with the part that fears discomfort or change? And most unsettlingly, what does it mean that the fiercest opponent you will ever face is yourself? By the end of this video, you will understand the hidden mechanisms behind this inner power struggle, why self-sabotage is so pervasive, and how awareness of it can transform your capacity for choice, control, and authentic self-mastery. Philosophically, this conflict has been observed and dissected for millennia. Nietzsche described the struggle between instinct, desire, and the will to power, the tension between the raw impulses of the self and the disciplined assertion of higher values. Socrates and the Stoics spoke of internal mastery, the importance of knowing oneself, and the ability to govern impulses rather than being governed by them. Jung identified the shadow, the repressed, often darker parts of the psyche that resist conscious intention, acting as both adversary and teacher. The battlefield within is not a flaw, it is the arena in which character, strength, and insight are forged. Psychologically, the struggle is deeply embedded in human nature. Cognitive biases, emotional reactivity, and unconscious drives often oppose our rational goals. The part of the brain designed for immediate gratification, the limbic system, clashes with the prefrontal cortex, which governs long-term planning, self-control, and delayed reward. This internal tug-of-war explains why we procrastinate, give in to temptation, or act against our better judgment despite understanding the consequences. The struggle is real, physiological, and relentless, and it requires awareness and strategy to navigate. Emotionally, this battlefield is fraught with tension. Guilt, frustration, and regret emerge when we act against our own intentions. Self-criticism arises from failure, yet unchecked, it fuels cycles of doubt and paralysis. At the same time, the mind is capable of profound self-support. Encouragement, discipline, and reflection can mobilize immense internal power. Recognizing the duality, the self as both adversary and ally, is the first step in learning to harness rather than be controlled by this internal struggle. Socially, the consequences of this internal conflict are profound. The inability to govern oneself shapes relationships, productivity, and societal engagement. Impulses suppressed too harshly may explode externally. Procrastination or avoidance may hinder collaboration or personal growth. Those who fail to confront their internal adversary often project blame outward, perceiving obstacles as external rather than as reflections of unmastered internal dynamics. Conversely, those who navigate the struggle with awareness develop integrity, resilience, and authentic agency. Narratively, this inner struggle is universal. The artist who battles self-doubt before creating, the entrepreneur who faces fear and uncertainty before launching, the student resisting distraction to pursue mastery, each is negotiating the same internal battlefield. Psychology provides insight into the mechanisms, philosophy offers guidance on values and purpose, and lived experience tests one's capacity for courage and discipline. The lesson is clear. The most consequential power struggle you will ever face is with yourself, and it determines the quality, depth, and direction of your life. Cognitively, recognizing this struggle allows for strategic engagement. Mindfulness, reflection, and self-awareness illuminate patterns of resistance and impulse. Understanding your tendencies enables deliberate action rather than reactive surrender. The prefrontal cortex, strengthened through repeated exercise of will and conscious choice, gradually gains mastery over impulsive, short-term drives. Yet knowledge alone is insufficient. Action in alignment with intention is what determines whether you are defeated by yourself or master the internal battlefield. Ultimately, the war within is not merely a challenge to endure. It is the crucible in which your character, purpose, and potential are forged. Awareness of this struggle is liberating. It illuminates why we act against our own interests, how power is both seated and seized internally, and what it means to claim agency over the trajectory of our lives. Subscribing provides a guide for navigating this internal landscape, offering insights, reflections, and strategies to convert awareness into meaningful self-mastery. The struggle between you and yourself is not abstract. It is wired into the very structure of the human mind. Every thought, impulse, and decision is shaped by competing forces. The immediate, instinctual drives of the limbic system clash with the reflective, goal-oriented reasoning of the prefrontal cortex. Evolutionarily, this tension ensured survival, balancing short-term needs against long-term planning. Today, the same mechanisms manifest as procrastination, self-doubt, or irrational choices, creating the illusion that we are our own worst enemies. Psychologically, this internal battle is amplified by cognitive biases and emotional distortions. The mind is adept at rationalizing failure, deflecting responsibility, and creating narratives that justify inaction. Confirmation bias reinforces patterns of thought that support avoidance, while the negativity bias ensures we dwell on setbacks more than successes. Jungian theory highlights the shadow, the unacknowledged or repressed aspects of the self that resist conscious control, often sabotaging our intentions. The irony is stark. The very traits we must master to achieve growth are embedded in our own psyche, operating beneath conscious awareness, subtly undermining our best-laid plans. Emotionally, the struggle is exhausting and paradoxical. Self-criticism, shame, and regret are natural byproducts of conflict, yet they can either paralyze or propel us. The difference lies in awareness and response. Individuals who cultivate emotional intelligence recognize the triggers and cycles of self-sabotage, learning to engage with them rather than be enslaved by them. This awareness transforms internal conflict from a source of frustration into a catalyst for growth. The adversary within is not merely an obstacle. It is a mirror, reflecting the parts of ourselves that require courage, discipline, and honesty.